Well, hey, good morning, church. Welcome to week 2 of our series in the book of Lamentations that we are calling Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy. And it really starts with a question today I want for you to think about, and make sure to throw it in the comments too below. A movie that you have recommended the most. And there's 2 movies that came out in 2003 that were significant. First is Lord of the Rings, Return of the King. That dropped in 2003. And just so you know, it has grossed like 1.2 billion with a B dollars. But there was another DVD that came out in 2003 that I have recommended to a ton of people. And are you ready for it? It's called The Happiest Baby on the Block. And if you know about The Happiest Baby on the Block, it's really a book that was written by this pediatrician who is trying to help parents in comforting their newborn baby. Because you bring a baby home from the hospital and you've maybe never done this before. You're not sure how to care for a baby, and baby's crying and upset, and this book, this DVD series, is actually written and produced to help you with caring for your kids. So when they're upset, when they need comfort, and so the author of the book kind of outlines some different strategies. I will tell you, some of them work, some of them the jury's still out. I'm not really sure if they all work, but it's a movie. It's something that I have recommended to lots of people. And today we're going to talk about Jerusalem's desire to be comforted, because they were in a season, they were in a time, they were in a space of great trauma and pain and darkness, and they cry out, but there is no one to comfort them. And I think we live in a time, we are a people who desire to be comfortable. We desire comfort, and the way that you know that you love comfort is if you bring a pillow on vacation. You know that if you bring a pillow on vacation, you are a person who desires comfort. I think we can have comfort food. I think there's different noise levels that we are comfortable with. You might want to come home from work and it's just been loud in the office and you just need it to be quiet. There's people that you are more comfortable around, in size of groups that you're more comfortable. Some people love big groups and to engage, and they see meeting people as an opportunity just to learn something new and to connect deeper. And other people are like, I'm just tired. I do not have the energy to connect with a big group. Give me 1 or 2 or 3 people at the most. And we're just people who I think pursue comfort. But what happens when the way that we normally pursue comfort doesn't work for us anymore? The background of Lamentations, if you missed it the first week, is it's a book that is really a series of poems written by Jeremiah reflecting on the destruction of Jerusalem in like 586 BC. That they're told again and again to turn back to God, that they have rebelled against him, but they don't listen. And so the Babylonians come in and they wipe out the city of Jerusalem, and they destroy it and they burn it to the ground. And Jeremiah writes these series of poems lamenting their situation. And Lamentations is not just written because of individual sin. It's written because of national corporate sin. It's written to mourn the reality of a broken world and to provide a warning that the gospel without justice is really no gospel at all. Like, it's not really good news. It's actually terrible news. That justice is such an important part of God's world. We see justice show up in the Bible like 160 times, and justice really deals with the power that is used in relationships. It's about treating people fairly, especially when you are in a position of great power. And there's 3 different Hebrew words that sort of describe this idea of justice, and one of the words that is used in the Hebrew scriptures is this Hebrew word mishpat, and mishpat is the idea of like giving people what they are due, like giving people what they have deserved, whether it be punishment, whether it be care, or whether it be protection. And so this is something that is close to God's heart. And in the scriptures today, Jerusalem is looking for that comfort. They're looking for that justice, that mishpat. And they don't find it in the places that they are used to. So if you have your Bible, I'm going to read Lamentations chapter 1. I'm going to read verse 12 to 22 so you can follow along. We'll put it up on your phone screen or TV screen or however you're watching this today. So we find these words. Is it nothing to you? And by the nothing is the suffering. Is the suffering nothing to you, all who pass by? Look around and see. Is any suffering like my suffering that was inflicted on me, that the Lord brought on me in the day of his fierce anger? From on high he sent fire, sent it down into my bones. He spread a net for my feet and turned me back. He made me desolate, faint all the day long. My sins have been bound into a yoke by his hands. They were woven together. They have come upon my neck, and the Lord has sapped my strength. He has handed me over to those I cannot withstand. The Lord has rejected all the warriors in my midst. He has summoned an army against me to crush my young men. In his winepress, the Lord has trampled the virgin daughter of Judah. This is why I weep, and my eyes overflow with tears. No one is near to comfort me, no one to restore my spirit. My children are destitute because the enemy has prevailed. Zion stretches out her hands, but there's no one to comfort her. The Lord has decreed for Jacob that his neighbors become his foes. Jerusalem has become an unclean thing among them. The Lord is righteous, yet I rebelled against his command. Listen, all you peoples, look upon my suffering. My young men and maidens have gone into exile. I called to my allies, but they betrayed me. My priests and my elders perished in the city while they searched for food to keep themselves alive. See, O Lord, how distressed I am. I'm in torment within, and in my heart I'm disturbed, for I have been rebellious. Outside the sword bereaves, inside there is only death. People have heard my groaning, but there is no one to comfort me. All my enemies have heard of my distress. They rejoice at what you have done. May you bring the day you have announced, so that they may become like me. Let all of their wickedness come before you. Deal with them as you have dealt with me. Because of all my sins, my groans are many, and my heart is faint. So in the first part of chapter 1, there's a spectator that is noticing all the suffering of Jerusalem, but now there's a shift to the city herself. Like the city, the personified city of Jerusalem is crying out, and we see it begin in verse 12. Like, is there any suffering like my suffering? Like, is there any pain like this pain? And the suffering is intensified always when people carry on as usual. Like the city could not picture or imagine in their mind a darker moment, a more difficult place, like more destruction. Like, how could it be worse than this? And then verse 13, we see Jeremiah use a couple different metaphors to describe what their situation is like. And they're actually similes if you're keeping score at home in like the whole English language, because he says it's like something. So just so you know, don't send me an email. It's actually a simile. So number one, that Jeremiah uses, the pictures he uses, that God's attack was like a fire. And in the scriptures, fire is used for judgment. It's also used for cleansing. So we have this story in 1 Kings 18 where the prophet Elisha, he's in a battle with all of these false prophets, the prophets of Baal, and there's this altar, and they have this competition, and they're going to call upon their God, and they're going to see if their God will answer by pouring out fire from heaven. And so the prophets of Baal, they call out to their God, and nothing happens. And then Elijah calls on his God, and there's water that's poured all over the altar, and like the whole thing is consumed. So God answers in that moment. And so the judgment of God is like fire. And then it also says, Jeremiah says that the judgment of God is like a hunter who spread a net for Jerusalem, like a net that would trap them. And this is an image that was used for hunters. You would trap an animal. Like, it wasn't going to get away. It wasn't going to be able to run to freedom. Like, it was going to have a moment in its life when it had nowhere to go. It was secure in the hands of the hunter. And then in verse 14, we see that the whole city of Jerusalem is crushed under the weight of their own sinfulness. So I brought this can crusher. When I was a little kid, we had one of these in our house, and you know how it works. You kind of like put it up on your wall and you crush cans. And so what's going on in Jerusalem right now is that they're being, see if I can do this, crushed. Oh, it feels good. Under the weight of their own brokenness. They've had opportunities to turn back to God, to once again be faithful, and they are being exposed under the crushing weight of their sin. Like, they're experiencing the crushing weight of being disconnected from God. They're experiencing the crushing weight of not having a rescuer, an advocate, someone to provide protection for them. And this is a consequence of their own sin, of their own unfaithfulness. Okay, so God's attack was like fire, number one. Number two, God's attack was like a hunter, like someone spreading out a net to catch Jerusalem. And then God's attack was like binding Jerusalem in a yoke placed on its people. A yoke would tie two animals together that would do some work, that would pull their own weight. And then in verse 13, they've lost the battle. And like grapes, Jerusalem's young men were crushed. Like in his wine press, the Lord has trampled the virgin daughter of Judah, the text says. So it's like fire. It's like a hunter's net. It's like the binding of a yoke on the necks of Jerusalem, and it's like a wine press. The image is like complete destruction. Verse 16, they're weeping with no comfort. The original Hebrew says, my eyes are drooping with tears. Verse 17, Jerusalem is an unclean thing. It's this Hebrew word nidah. And nidah is like ceremonial uncleanliness. Like their state, like something needs to change about their state. They need to be purified. They need to be clean. And in Judaism, when this was true of you, you had to go before the priest, and you couldn't just clean yourself. You had to be declared clean by the priest. Verse 18 is the turning point, though. 4 words: the Lord is righteous. So all of this is happening. I'm being crushed under the weight of my own brokenness, my own sin, my own rebellion, but the Lord is righteous. I've rebelled against his command. The Lord is in the right. I've been rebellious against him. I'm not blaming God. I'm not saying he did something that was unfair or unjust. It's hard. I'm suffering. It's dark. It's painful. It's difficult. It's traumatic. But he's in the right. Like, I'm the one who has stepped out of line. The city of Jerusalem, we've been the ones that have been unfaithful. So God's not the one that's on trial. We are the ones that are on trial. This word righteous is like this Bible word that, like, what does it actually mean? The way that I like to think of it is righteousness has to do with fulfilling the demands of a relationship. And that's what God has done. Like, he's continued to be faithful and good and present with his people. It's the people of Israel who have not done that. And then in verse 20, I want to read verse 20 again. We see some of the emotional effects. Like, see, O Lord, how distressed I am. I'm in torment within, and in my heart I am disturbed. Like when you've done something wrong, like when you stand in need of forgiveness, when you've stepped out of line, when you failed to live according to your values, and you feel bad about that. I believe that is grace showing up to the party. That like when you feel a sense of guilt, like I didn't live up to my values, that's grace showing up. Shame is that I'm unworthy of belonging. But guilt can actually be a gift, because I believe guilt can propel you to have an open mind and an open heart to changing, to things being different, to making different kinds of decisions. And this is a moment in the history of Israel where the city is guilty of being unfaithful, of not listening to God's heart and not living in God's way. And then the prayer of faith at the end is a plea for justice. Verse 22, Jeremiah calls out that God would deal with the people groups who have come in and destroyed the city. And I think a lot of people, when they come to this part, they're like, yeah, Jeremiah wants God to get them. God wants to bring judgment on everybody else. I don't think this is retribution. I think that Jeremiah's heart here is that the whole world would feel the crushing weight of their own sin, of their own brokenness, so that they might see the opportunity that is before them to turn to God, as Jerusalem is in the process of turning back to God. I think grace isn't amazing unless judgment is real. It's why in South Dakota we love summer so much, because we have winter, you guys. And it is the worst sometimes. January 15th, you think that summer is never going to come. If we had 75 and sunny all the time, like summer wouldn't be that big of a deal. But grace is amazing because judgment is an actual thing. It's real. It has a crushing weight to it. And so the fact that we can experience the love and the grace and compassion of God, like that's what makes our heart sing. And then sin has real and devastating consequences, both individually and nationally and corporately for Jerusalem. You know, a lot of times we hear, especially in the New Testament, like the Apostle Paul will say, the wages of sin is death. That's in Romans 6. And I think a lot of times in the church, the way that we interpret that is the wages of sin is hell. So like that's what you get. Like if you sin, like that's where you're going to end up. But that's not what Paul says. Paul says that the wages of sin is death. So here's my question, like when's the last time you saw that playing out? When's the last time you saw death creeping into a marriage? Like when's the last time you saw death creeping into what you type and send to another person? When's the last time that you saw death in what you say out loud? When's the last time you saw death creeping into your perspective, creeping into your priorities, creeping into your values, creeping into what you believe? The wages of sin is death. But the gift of God, Paul will say, is eternal life. And this section of Lamentations shows us the very real, in both individually and corporately, the very real consequences of brokenness and of sin. So the wages of sin is death. And that question, is death finding its way into your story right now? Like, would you be able to be honest enough to actually step back and reflect and examine your own words, your own perspective, your own choices, your own actions? And then another question, is that happening in our world? And are we okay with that? Are we okay with the wages of sin being death in our own lives, but then also in the lives of our world and nation and country and city? Lamentations 1 says that consequences don't have to be immediate to have impact. Just because that there aren't immediate consequences, it doesn't mean that there won't be eventual consequences. And this chapter serves as a reminder that God did not spare his own people from the consequences of their own choices. Lamentations is what happens when God says, I love you too much to allow you to keep doing that. And if you will not stop, I will in grace send you reminder and warning to turn back to me. But Lamentations says, like, if you will not stop, I will stop you. And the truth is, like, we will not get away with unfaithfulness. We will not get away with rebellion. And you might say, well, what's your proof of that? Well, how about in Jerusalem in 586, when the whole city's destroyed? How about in Israel in 722? That's the proof that the God that we serve is a God who is just. And justice is going to rule the world. Desire is not going to rule the world. God's justice comes in partnership with his grace to rule the world in that way. And the last thing we have to say today is that darkness is part of the redemptive story. And so I want to talk about confession. I think confession gets a bad rap. Confession is, what's the really point of that? Like, why would you do that? What even is it? You have this image of like walking into a church building and like confessing to a person. But confession is really just to agree with God, to say the same thing about your own sin that God says about it. And it's also the flip side of it is to say the same thing about your identity that God says about your identity. Confession is not a way to earn God's favor. It's not a way to get back in right relationship with God. Confession doesn't help you earn God's favor, but confession is a rhythm that reminds you of God's favor, of his grace, of his kindness, of his love poured out on you. Confession is laying a stake in the ground and saying, like, this choice that I've made, this thing in my life, like, that's not what defines me. Like, I belong to Christ. He defines me. I am what has been finished for me. And if the words regarding what I have done never come out of my mouth, then the forgiveness that Jesus wants to offer me is never going to find its place into our heart, into our soul, into our life. So it's got to begin with our mouth. To even go back to Paul, to with your mouth confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. And part of that confession, if we're going to confess that is true of God, we need to confess what is true of ourselves. So lament through confession, I believe, connects us to the reality of a shattered world, of a broken me, and a holy, rescuing, and just God. So 4 words: the Lord is righteous. Like, God, you are in the right. And I'm standing before you in agreement that I confess that I have worked to diminish, I've worked to hide, I've worked to push down and bury all the things that I've done wrong. When I do that, I'm not earning anything, but I'm reminded again of the grace that has found its way to me. When I confess, I'm reminding myself of the grace that has been placed upon me, and the only appropriate response for that truth, that has happened, is this continual refrain of worship. The Lord is righteous. And I don't know where you are today. I don't know how this hits you. I don't know if you're far from God, far from church, and I don't know if you've ever had an opportunity to give your life to God. But even over the internet today, I want to give you an opportunity to do that. And this is really the beginning of a conversation, that there's a lot that you probably need to say to God today, but this could be a really great start, just to be able to understand, maybe for the first time, that God has his eye on you and you have always mattered to him. And so I'm going to just pray a prayer that you can recite in the quiet of your own heart, in the quiet of your own home, just as a way to confess, to agree with God what is true. Like, about your own life, about your own decisions, about your own choices, about your own posture. And it's just a very simple prayer that we pray around invitation on a regular basis. And it's just that, Jesus, I give you my life. I believe that you are the Son of God, crucified for my sin, raised to life. I receive you now. And if you've prayed that for the first time, man, I would so love to know that. I would love to get some resources in your hands. I'd love to invite you to join our community and to engage in what God is doing in you and in the world. An invitation, I'm just going to call us to live by those 4 words of worship. The Lord is righteous. And to live in light of his righteousness and his faithfulness to us. And let that be our song of worship until we can find our place back in that daycare, lifting our voices together. Let's not wait to lift our voices. Let's lift our voices now. The Lord is righteous. Grace and peace.